She was 19 years old the night they left her to die on Elhorn Pass, and she remembers the cold before she remembers anything else. It was her father's business partner, a well-dressed man named Silas Vane, who drove the wagon on without her when her ankle broke on the ice, telling the others that a girl who could not keep pace was a girl who would slow them all into the same grave. All she carried down from that mountain, when she finally came down it alive, was 4 silver dollars sewn into her hem, and a grief so heavy it had teeth. With that money, and nothing else in the world, she bought the rotting, forgotten cabin of a trapper nobody remembered, tucked into a fold of pine and granite above a town called Ashford Hollow. $9 in back taxes, paid to a clerk who laughed at her for wasting good coin on a dead man's shack. It seemed, to everyone who heard of it, the last foolish act of a young woman with nothing left to lose. But beneath the floorboards of that cabin lay something sealed away for 30 years, a secret that did not belong to her alone, but to every family in the valley below. And when she finally uncovered it, it would not only save her life, it would give an entire town back what had been stolen from it in the dark. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Josephine Callaway. If you are watching this from a place that has been written off by everyone else, a town, a farm, a name nobody remembers anymore, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And if a quiet story of restoration is the kind of thing your evening needs, consider following along with us so you never miss the next one. Josephine Callaway had been raised to believe that worth was not always visible on the surface, and that the things people threw away were rarely as worthless as they looked. It was a lesson her father, Thomas Callaway, taught her not with words, but with the whole shape of his life. He had come west from Ohio as a young man with a wagon of goods nobody in Denver wanted: bent nails, chipped crockery, bolts of cloth with water stains along one edge, and instead of discarding them, he had sold them cheap to families who could not afford new, and in doing so built, over 20 years, the most trusted freight and supply outfit in 3 counties. He used to tell Josephine, when she was still small enough to sit on a flour barrel and watch him work, that a thing's price was only ever what a careless man was willing to pay for it, and that its true value was something else entirely, something you had to be patient enough to see. She grew up in the back rooms of trading posts and the beds of freight wagons, learning to read a ledger before she learned to read a novel, learning to judge the honesty of a man by the calluses on his hands rather than the cut of his coat. Her mother had died of a fever when Josephine was 7, and so it was her father who raised her, who taught her to shoot a rifle steady enough to bring down supper, who taught her arithmetic using sacks of grain and barrels of nails, who taught her, above all, to look twice at anything the world called worthless before she believed it. By the time she was 17, she was keeping the books for Callaway Freight and Supply herself, and doing it better than the 2 clerks her father had let go because of her. She had her father's steady hands and her mother's quiet stubbornness, and there was not a man in Ashford Hollow who did not know her name and respect the sharpness behind her eyes, even if they underestimated, as men so often did, exactly how far that sharpness could see. It was in the summer of her 18th year that Silas Vane came into their lives, a smooth, talking man from the East with capital to invest, and an easy laugh that made her father trust him faster than he trusted most. Vane bought half interest in Callaway Freight, promising to expand the routes over the mountains into the new mining camps, and for a while it seemed a good bargain, the business growing, the wagons multiplying. Her father working himself thinner and grayer with every passing season, chasing a prosperity that always seemed to sit one contract further off. Josephine did not trust Vane from the first handshake, though she could not have said exactly why. only that his eyes did their own separate arithmetic when he looked at her father's ledgers. Arithmetic that did not match the sums he spoke aloud. She kept her suspicions mostly to herself, because a young woman's instinct was not proof, and because her father, in the last years of his life, had grown so weary that she did not wish to burden him with worry he could not fix. She would learn, before the year was out, that a daughter's instinct is very often the truest ledger of all. Her father died in the deep cold of that same winter, his heart failing him quietly in his sleep after a long day riding the high routes to inspect a new supply camp. And Josephine buried him on a hillside above Ashford Hollow, with more of the town in attendance than she had known cared for him, which was its own strange comfort in the depth of her grief. What she did not know, standing at that grave with snow settling on her father's fresh headstone, was that Silas Vane had spent the preceding months quietly buying up notes and debts against the freight company from creditors in Denver, positioning himself, with the patience of a man who had done this before in other towns under other names, to own outright what he had only ever half owned in name. Within 3 months of her father's death, Vane produced papers, drawn by a lawyer Josephine had never heard her father mention, that named him sole proprietor of Callaway Freight and Supply, citing debts she had never seen entered in any ledger she had kept. She fought it as best a 19-year-old woman with no lawyer of her own could fight it, going to the county recorder, to the bank, to anyone in Ashford Hollow who might remember her father's true accounts. But paper has a way of outweighing memory in the eyes of the law, and one by one the doors closed on her. Vane, for his part, offered her what he called a mercy, a position as his own bookkeeper, at a wage, in the business that had been her father's whole life, and when she refused him to his face in front of half the town, he smiled the same smooth smile he had always smiled, and told her that pride was a poor traveling companion for a woman with empty pockets. She would not fully understand until later how much that refusal had wounded his vanity, nor how far a vain man's cruelty could reach when he believed no one of consequence was watching. The final blow came that same spring, when Vane announced he was leading a small party of investors and surveyors over Elhorn Pass to inspect a new mining claim before the summer cruise arrived, and Josephine, desperate for any wage at all, and still hoping to prove her worth to men who might yet remember her father's honesty, hired on as camp cook and ledger keeper for the expedition. The last respectable work left open to her in a town where Vane's word now carried more weight than her name. The crossing began well enough, 6 men and Josephine on mules and on foot, climbing into thinning air under a sky the color of a bruise. But a storm came down off the peaks faster than any of them expected, and in the scramble to find shelter before nightfall, Josephine's ankle turned on a shelf of ice and snapped beneath her with a sound she still heard some nights in her sleep. She called out, and for one long moment she believed they would stop for her, the way any decent party stops for its wounded. Instead, she watched Silas Vane look at her over his shoulder, weigh her, the way he weighed every ledger, against the cost of delay, and give the order to move on, telling the others that the mountain did not wait for the weak, that they would send help back from the far camp if the weather allowed. No help ever came. She dragged herself into the shelter of a rock overhang as the storm closed over the pass entirely, and she lay there through 2 days and 2 nights she still cannot fully account for, certain, in the coldest hours, that she was going to die exactly as Vane had calculated she might, quietly, conveniently, out of sight of anyone who would ask questions. It was stubbornness more than hope that kept her moving when the storm finally broke, a crawling, half-blind descent down the leeward slope on a splinted ankle bound with strips of her own petticoat, following the sound of water, because her father had once told her that water always finds its way down to people, and people are usually not far behind it. She came stumbling out of the tree line 2 days later into a narrow high valley she did not recognize. Half a day's hard walk from Ashford Hollow proper, alive by a margin so thin it frightened the trapper's widow, old Mrs. Furlong, who found her collapsed near the creek and took her in without a single question about how she had come to be there. It was Mrs. Furlong, nursing her back to strength over the following weeks, who first told her about the abandoned cabin higher up the same narrow valley. The old trapping shack that had belonged, decades before, to a solitary man named Amos Whitlock, who had vanished from those mountains so long ago that most of the town had forgotten he ever existed at all, and whose claim had sat delinquent on the county's tax rolls ever since, waiting, the clerk would later say with a laugh, for a fool foolish enough to want it. Josephine had exactly $4 left to her name, sewn into the hem of her skirt against the very desperation she now found herself in. And when she was well enough to walk on her mending ankle, she took every one of those coins into the county office and laid them on the counter, and asked what $9 in back taxes on the old Whitlock claim would buy her. The clerk, a thin, sour man named Pruitt, looked at her rough boots and her borrowed coat and laughed outright, told her she was buying a leaking roof and a dead man's ghosts, but he took her money all the same, because money was money, and because it was not his business to save a woman from a bargain she seemed determined to make. Josephine walked the 6 miles up to the cabin that same afternoon with the deed folded inside her coat, and stood a long while at the edge of the clearing before she went in, looking at the sagging roof and the door hanging from one hinge, and she thought of her father's voice telling her that a thing's true value was never what a careless man was willing to pay for it. She did not yet know how true those words would prove. She knew only that she had nowhere else left to go, and that this ruin, whatever it was hers. The cabin itself, when she finally pushed the door open, was smaller and darker than she had imagined. One low room with a stone hearth gone black with disuse, a rope bed frame rotted through, and the smell of 30 winters of dust and mice and pine sap thick enough to make her cough. But it was dry beneath its sagging roof, and it was hers, free and clear. In a way nothing in her life had been hers since her father died, and that alone was worth more to her that first night than any comfort Vane's wages might have bought. She spent her first weeks there simply surviving, patching the roof with bark and pine boughs, snaring rabbits with skills her father had taught her on long ago hunting trips, trading the occasional pelt or bit of mended harness with Mrs. Furlong for flour and salt, and slowly, in the doing of it, something in her that had been crushed flat by grief and betrayal began, very quietly, to unbend. It was on an evening in her 4th week, while she was scraping 30 years of grime from the hearthstones, so she might finally build a proper fire against the coming autumn chill, that her fingers found a seam in the stone that did not belong there, a place where the mortar had been worked loose and reset by a hand far more careful than the rest of the cabin's rough construction suggested. Curiosity, and perhaps the restless suspicion her father had bred into her, would not let her leave it alone. She worked the loose stone free with the point of her hunting knife, and behind it, wedged into a cavity clearly built for the purpose, she found a small tin box, rusted at the seams but sealed tight, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age, a single folded letter in a shaking, careful hand, and a rough hand-drawn map marked with symbols she did not yet understand. The letter was signed by Amos Whitlock, dated some 31 years before, and its opening line alone was enough to make her sit down hard on the cold hearthstones, with her heart hammering against her ribs. For it read, If any honest soul finds this, know that I was cheated of what was rightfully the valley's, and I have hidden the proof where no thief thought to look." Josephine read that letter 3 times through by the light of her single tallow candle before she trusted herself to understand it, and what it told her, in the plain, halting words of a man who had clearly not expected anyone to ever read them, was that Amos Whitlock had not simply been a trapper who wandered off into the mountains and vanished, as the town's fading memory of him suggested, but a man who had, in his younger years, discovered and legally staked the spring-fed watercourse that fed the entire valley below. The very water that Ashford Hollow's farms and the town's own well drew from to this day. According to the letter, Whitlock had intended that claim as a gift to the growing settlement, a common right he meant to sign over to the town's founders so that no single family could ever own the water and hold the valley to ransom over it. But before he could complete that transfer, a young and ambitious land agent, working on behalf of a wealthy Eastern investor, had forged papers redirecting the water claim into private hands, and when Whitlock rode to town to expose the fraud, he was met not with justice, but with threats. His character quietly ruined by whispered lies about drink and debt, that the town, trusting the smooth-talking newcomer over the rough old trapper, had been all too willing to believe. Whitlock, the letter said, had retreated to his cabin in bitterness and fear, hidden the true, unforged deed and the evidence of the fraud where he believed it would be safe until an honest hand found it, and intended to return to town once he had gathered proof enough to be believed. He never got the chance. The letter broke off there, unfinished, and Josephine understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air, that Amos Whitlock had likely never lived to write another word, silenced, one way or another, by the very fraud he meant to expose. What struck her hardest, sitting alone in that ruined cabin with the letter trembling in her hands, was the name the map's faded corner bore beside a small, careful notation reading agent of record. A name written in ink gone brown with age, but perfectly legible: Josiah Vane. She had to read it twice to be certain her eyes had not deceived her, and when she was certain, she understood all at once that the theft of the valley's water and the theft of her father's freight company were not 2 separate cruelties visited on 2 separate generations by 2 separate men, but the same family's hand reaching across 30 years. Josiah Vane, the grandfather who had forged a mountain claim, Silas Vane, the grandson who had forged a business debt, each of them dressing the same appetite in the fashion of his own era. It explained, in a single terrible instant, why the valley's water rights had always sat, unquestioned by anyone in living memory, under the control of the Vane family mill and irrigation company downstream of Ashford Hollow, a company that charged every farm and household in the valley a yearly fee for water that, by rights older than any of them, ought to have belonged to the town in common. She sat through the rest of that night with the letter and the map spread before her on the hearthstones, piecing together what still needed proving, understanding that she held in her 2 hands not merely her own vindication, but the means, if she was brave and careful enough, to give an entire valley back something that had been quietly stolen from it before most of its current families had even arrived. The days that followed were the most careful of Josephine's life, for she understood that a letter and a hand-drawn map, however compelling, would mean nothing against a family as entrenched and as respected as the Vanes, unless she could find the buried, unforged deed the letter promised existed, and find some corroborating proof, besides, that would hold up before men inclined to disbelieve a penniless young woman with every reason in the world to hate the Vane name. The map, once she studied it by daylight, showed not the cabin itself, but a second cache, marked with the same careful symbol Whitlock had used for the tin box in the hearth, situated some quarter mile above the cabin at the base of an old granite outcrop shaped. The map noted in Whitlock's cramped hand, like a sleeping bear. It took her 3 full days of searching the slope in the thin autumn light, favoring her still-mending ankle over loose scree, before she found the outcrop and, beneath it, a shallow buried strongbox wrapped in tarred canvas that had somehow survived 3 decades of frost and thaw nearly intact. Inside, she found what Whitlock's letter had promised, the original, properly notarized water claim bearing the territorial seal and the true signatures of the valley's founding families, the very document Josiah Vane's forgery had been drawn up to replace, along with a small pouch of gold dust that Whitlock had evidently been saving toward the legal fight he never got to wage, and a second letter, shorter than the first, naming 2 other men, now surely long dead themselves, who had witnessed the original claim being properly filed and could, in their time, have testified to its truth. It was not. Josephine understood as she carried that strongbox back down to the cabin with trembling arms, a fortune in the way the town would later whisper it to be, though the gold alone was more money than she had held in her whole life. It was something far more valuable than gold, a truth that had been waiting 30 years in the mountain's cold ground for someone patient enough and wronged enough to come looking for it. She did not act rashly, though every instinct in her grieving, furious heart urged her to ride straight into Ashford Hollow and fling the forged deed at Silas Vane's feet in front of the whole town. She had learned too well, watching her father's business slip away on the strength of paper alone, that proof unaccompanied by strategy was easily buried again by men with money enough to bury it. Instead, she went first, quietly, to the one man in the valley she still trusted absolutely. Old Judge Ambrose Teller, retired now from the circuit court, but still respected by every honest family in 3 counties. A man who had known her father since before Josephine was born, and who had watched, with visible unease he had never quite voiced aloud, as Vane's papers stripped the Callaway name of everything her father built. She rode to his cabin outside town on a gray October morning with the strongbox wrapped in a feed sack across her saddle, and she laid every piece of it before him, the letter, the map, the true and forged deeds side by side, the pouch of gold, and watched the old judge's face move slowly from polite skepticism through disbelief into a grim, quiet fury she had never once seen him show. He examined the seals with a magnifying glass he kept for exactly such purposes, compared the forged signatures against notarized documents he still had from his own years on the bench, and by the time the light through his window had shifted from morning to afternoon, he told her plainly that what she carried, properly presented, was enough to unseat 30 years of quiet theft, but that presenting it carelessly would only give Silas Vane time and warning enough to destroy what evidence he could and flee with what he could carry, exactly as she suspected his grandfather might once have wished to do and never got the chance. Together, over the following 2 weeks, they built a case, the judge quietly gathering affidavits from the oldest families still in the valley, families who remembered, when pressed gently, half-forgotten stories their own grandparents had told of the old trapper who disappeared, and the smooth land agent who arrived soon after with papers already drawn. Word of Josephine's discovery could not stay entirely secret in a town the size of Ashford Hollow, and it was not long before whispers reached Silas Vane himself that the Callaway girl had been digging around up at the old Whitlock place and had come down the mountain with a strongbox and a story that named his family. Vane did not wait to see how much of that whisper was true before he acted to protect himself, and his response revealed, more clearly than any forged deed ever could, exactly the kind of man he was. He rode to the cabin himself one gray afternoon, with 2 hired men at his back, not to reason with her, but to intimidate her into silence. standing in the doorway of the very shack he had once mocked her for buying and telling her, in the same smooth voice he had always used, that a young woman alone in the mountains ought to remember how easily accidents happened up here, that the same storm that had nearly claimed her once could always come again for a fool who insisted on making enemies of men who could crush her with a single signature. Josephine, who had spent 2 days and 2 nights certain she was dying on that very mountain because of this man's own calculations, found in that moment that she was no longer afraid of him in the way he expected her to be, and she told him plainly, with Judge Teller's affidavits already safely filed where Vane could never reach them, that his grandfather's forged deed and his own forged debts had both been found out, and that the only accident left to worry about now was the one about to befall his family's name. Vane's composure cracked for the first time she had ever seen it crack, his easy charm collapsing into something uglier and more desperate, and he made, in his fury, threats plain enough that even his own hired men exchanged uneasy glances. Threats Josephine would later repeat, word for careful word, before the circuit court that convened in Ashford Hollow that winter. One of those 2 hired men, a quiet young writer named Ezra Duncan, who had taken Vane's wages only because work was scarce that season, lingered a moment at the edge of the clearing after his employer had stormed off down the trail, and before he followed, he told Josephine, low enough that Vane would not hear, that he had carried papers between Vane's house and the county recorder's office more than once that autumn. Papers he had not been permitted to read, but had been paid handsomely to deliver in secret and never mention aloud to anyone in town. It was a small thing, offered nervously and without any promise attached to it. But Josephine understood at once that it might matter a great deal, and she asked him, as gently as she knew how, whether he might be willing to repeat as much before Judge Teller, under oath. Should it ever come to that? Ezra did not answer her that day, only touched his hat brim and rode off after his employer, looking as though he already regretted having spoken at all, and Josephine spent the following restless week uncertain whether his conscience would win out over his fear of a man who so plainly did not forgive disloyalty gently. It was Judge Teller, in the end, who rode out to the Duncan family's small holding himself, not to press the young man, but simply to sit with him and his worried mother over coffee and remind him, in the unhurried way of a man who had spent a lifetime reading the fear out of frightened witnesses, that the law in that county still protected honest men who told the truth, whatever a wealthier man might threaten. Ezra came forward within the week, and his account of the papers he had carried, cross-checked against dates on the forged Callaway debts, closed the last gap in the case Judge Teller had been building, turning what had been strong suspicion into evidence no lawyer, however skilled, could talk a jury past. The proceedings, when they finally came, drew every family in the valley into the schoolhouse that served the town for want of a proper courthouse, and Josephine stood before them not as the pitiable, penniless girl half the town had assumed she'd become, but as her father's daughter in full, laying out the letter, the true deed, the witnessed affidavits, and her own account of the mountain crossing with a steadiness that surprised even Judge Teller, who sat that day not as arbiter, but as witness himself. Silas Vane's lawyer argued what he could, that decades-old papers proved nothing, that a trapper's rambling letter was no evidence at all. But the true deed's territorial seal could not be argued away, nor could the surviving elderly witnesses who stood, one by one, and confirmed in trembling voices the story their own parents had told them of the honest trapper wronged by a smooth stranger's forged papers. It took the circuit judge, brought in from the county seat for the matter, only 3 days to rule the original water claim valid, and the Vane family's control of it fraudulent from its very foundation, restoring the valley's water rights to common ownership under the town itself, to be managed thereafter by an elected board rather than any single family's ledger. It took rather longer, but not so very much longer, for the same proceedings to expose the forged debts Silas Vane had used to strip Thomas Callaway's freight company from his own daughter. Once Judge Teller, his interest thoroughly roused, set his own retired but formidable skills to examining those papers as closely as he had examined Whitlock's. By the time the snow closed in that winter, Silas Vane had fled Ashford Hollow in the night rather than face the fuller reckoning the judge was assembling against him. Leaving behind a mill and a business the county swiftly placed into trust for the valley's benefit, and leaving behind, too, a name that would be spoken in that valley for a generation afterward as a warning rather than a title of respect. Josephine did not chase him, did not need to. The mountain and the water and the truth had done what pursuit never could, and Silas Vane, wherever he ran to, ran as a man exposed rather than a man triumphant, which was, Josephine came to understand, its own quiet and sufficient justice. What Josephine did with what she had found mattered, in the end, even more than the finding of it. She could have kept the gold dust for herself and called it fair payment for 2 days freezing on a mountainside, and no one in the valley would have begrudged her a single grain of it. She could have pressed her own claim to the water rights, since it was her $9 and her own hands that had uncovered the truth of them, and built herself a fortune to rival the one the Vanes had lost. She did neither. She used the gold, modest as it truly was once weighed and valued honestly, to help rebuild the schoolhouse roof that had been leaking for years under the Vane Mill's stingy tax assessments. And she stood before the valley's new water board, the very first time it convened, and formally waived any personal claim to the restored water rights beyond the same equal share every farm and household in Ashford Hollow now held, saying only that Amos Whitlock had meant this water for the whole valley 30 years before, and she did not intend to be the second person in as many generations to take for herself what was meant to be shared. She rebuilt the old trapper's cabin, board by board, that following spring and summer, not as a monument to what she'd found beneath it, but as her own home. The first true home she had owned outright since her father's death, and she kept, framed above the very hearth where she had found the tin box, Amos Whitlock's original letter, so that anyone who sat by that fire would understand exactly what patience and honesty could still accomplish, even 30 years buried in cold mountain stone. And so we return, as we always do, to where we began, to a 19-year-old girl left broken and freezing on a mountain pass by a man who believed her too small a thing to matter, who believed a girl with $4 silver sewn into her hem was already as good as forgotten. Josephine Callaway proved him wrong in every way a person can be proven wrong. She took the cheapest, most overlooked thing in the whole valley, a leaking cabin nobody else wanted, and treated it the way her father had once taught her to treat every discarded thing that crossed her path, with patience enough to look twice before believing it worthless. What she found beneath its floor was not merely gold, though there was gold, and it was not merely vindication, though she earned that too. What she found was a wrong left unrighted for 30 years, waiting for someone with nothing left to lose and everything left to give, and she gave it back, whole, to the very community that had once, through no real fault of its own, let her family and Amos Whitlock's memory both be quietly wronged. That is the whole of what this story has to teach, if it teaches anything at all, that the world is full of things and people written off as worthless by careless men in a hurry, and that it takes someone patient, someone wronged enough to understand what wrongness costs, to look again and find what was really there all along. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Josephine Callaway's story. If it moved you even a little, we would be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need a reminder that overlooked things and overlooked people are so rarely as worthless as the world first judges them to be. And if you haven't yet, we would love for you to follow along with our channel so you never miss the next story we have to tell. We'll leave you tonight with the same question Josephine's story leaves us with. Is there a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? Tell us about it in the comments below. We read every single one, and we love hearing where your own stories overlap with the ones we tell. Until next time, stay close.